International Affairs Analyst Stan Grant is here now to talk through this escalating situation in Afghanistan. G'day Stan, what do you make of it all?
Well, it is entirely predictable, isn't it? Because history tells us this is exactly what happened. You can go back to when the Taliban first took control of the country. It seized on what was a power vacuum. It was in the wake of the Soviet Red Army pull out of Afghanistan in that case, which tipped the region over into a civil war, and the Taliban took control. What have we seen since then? We've seen, of course, the war with the United States and allies against the Taliban for the past 20 years. And now as the Americans prepare to leave the country, we're seeing this increasing insurgency. As you say, they're sweeping across the country, and this is the strategy, Dan. They already have control in the rural areas. That was a stronghold for the Taliban, particularly around the Afghan-Pakistan border. Then they move out into some of the regional cities. Kandahar has fallen. That's the second biggest city in Afghanistan. And then they start to move in on the bigger centres like Kabul. And the fear is that Kabul could fall in a matter of weeks, perhaps a matter of months. But there seems to be an inevitability about it, given the rapid advance of the Taliban. But history tells us what happens here, and we're seeing it play out again.
Stan, this is clearly a strategic strike, and we know that Taliban now controls a third of the country's national capitals. Do you have a sense of where this is going?
Well, where this is going is a march on Kabul. You know, the negotiations where the Taliban was brought to the negotiating table, Pakistan was able to bring them to the table. The US had brokered these negotiations, but they've stalled. And why? Because Zalmay Khalilzad, who is the US envoy there, the US negotiator, says that the Taliban wants the lion's share of power in the country. As someone put it, why would you negotiate when you are winning? And right now, as far as the Taliban is concerned, it is winning, as you say, a third of the capitals, but strategically, those rural areas that it controls, if you look at a map of Afghanistan right now and shade it in different colours, well, the largest section is held by the Taliban, less by the government, and then the larger section beyond that is contested area, but contested area that the Taliban has shown it is able to take. In some cases, Dan, the Afghan forces, the Afghan military has simply melted away and allowed the Taliban to take control. The Afghan military that has had tens of billions of dollars pumped into it over the past 20 years, trained by American and foreign forces, has the latest weapons technology, but not enough to deal with this insurgency, which is able to take a smaller force and defeat a larger force, because there is not that willingness perhaps on the part of Afghan troops. We know there have been complaints about corruption, a lack of leadership. Some say they haven't been paid. All of that starts to dissipate morale, and that feeds into this Taliban advance.
And we saw so much made of the United States, Australia, other Western democracies taking troops out of there, which is exactly what's happening now, as we just heard from Barbara Miller as well. These troops are now going back from the United States to secure embassy staff and part of that Hamid Karzai airport. Is this going to be a long-term deployment now for the United States?
No, I think it's very strategic. I think they're going in there to be able to ensure that their nationals are able to get out of the country safely. This isn't about going back in there and propping up the Afghan government or going back in there and necessarily fighting on the front line. If their troops come under attack, then clearly they'll retaliate. But Joe Biden's been very clear about this. The troops will start to withdraw from August 31. He wants all troops out by 9/11, September 11, the anniversary, of course, of those terrorist attacks by al-Qaeda that tipped the region over into this conflict. But there is a very clear strategic decision that's been made here to leave the country. But what happens after that? What responsibilities beyond that do foreign countries, foreign forces have? Because clearly the Afghan forces' ability to repel this Taliban advance is going to be diminished without significant support from overseas. You must pay attention as well here, Dan, to regional countries. China has an interest in the region, Russia has an interest in the region, and strategically, critically, Pakistan. Pakistan has long been accused of supporting the Taliban, of funding the Taliban, of allowing the Taliban forces to move across into its border and then return back into Afghanistan. It sees the Taliban as part of its strategic depth in its ongoing fight against India, and doesn't want to allow India to get a foothold inside Afghanistan. Now, Imran Khan Pakistan, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, says that he is not interested in propping up one side or another. He believes this needs to be sorted out inside Afghanistan. You take that with a grain of salt, frankly, because history tells us again that Pakistan has supported the Afghan Taliban, even as it has fought against Pakistani Taliban forces on its side of the border. It is a deadly game. It overlaps. There are contradictions. But what we are seeing right now is something that brings in regional powers, empowers the Taliban, fighting a weakened civilian government and an Afghan military that this far has not been able to repel that Taliban advance while foreign forces leave the country.
And I'm fascinated by that point, Stan, you make about some of those big players, I guess, to the east of Afghanistan. But what about to the west, around the Middle East, or even north to former Russian states or Russia itself?
Well, Iran's critical. Iran is absolutely critical here, and there have been reports that there have been some Iranian forces operating inside the country. We know that Afghanistan and Pakistan and what happens there is very much influenced by what happens in the Middle East. The rise of the Taliban, Dan, was directly funded by money that came out of the Middle East, that was pumped into Pakistan during the Soviet invasion. We saw an increase in madrasas, Islamic schools that the Taliban emerged out of. The Taliban, Talib means scholar, and that they emerged out of those schools and then, of course, formed this force which was able to take over the country. It's absolutely critical to factor in that region when you look at what might play out here. And Iran is a country to keep a very close eye on. The other thing to look at here is terrorist militant organisations themselves. We know that it was Al-Qaeda and the support that Al-Qaeda got from the Taliban providing a safe haven for Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda inside Afghanistan, from where they plotted the 9/11 attacks that led to this war in the first place. There are concerns that with the Taliban back in control, yes, Al-Qaeda is still there, but there's also concerns about Islamic State getting a foothold in the country as well, which takes you right back to where you were in the lead up to this conflict more than 20 years ago.